Hey, what's up, guys? I was a little late for the. Wanted to do this on Sunday, but at work I was just too tired. I was too busy with stuff, so I figured I'd get to it since I covered Dresden last month. Uh, this is I like these. These I like the even more in depth Osprey books. They're a little thicker. At this point, not that much more expensive, but very. I mean, the whole like what Osprey usually does, it's great, man. Which is a lot. The original artwork, maps, even diagrams, more maps. Yeah, lots of photos, principal players, principal weaponry. The usual. In terms of LeMay, who is LeMay? Right? Just showed him. Curtis LeMay. Right. Rarely can one man said to be responsible for a campaign's success. Essentially, the strategic bombing campaign with the B-29, which was a new uh, bomber, a very expensive, probably the most expensive weapon ever made in the war. Apparently, um, the situation is an idea of this man adapting to the problems that was being presented in bombing Japan. uh, and finding a way to make this very, very expensive weapon reap results. And after a breaking in period, he did just that. The, obviously, we're going to be focusing on the firebombing campaign. But go into some of the background of it. Of course, right? Attackers' capabilities, defenders' capabilities, campaign objectives, right? The tactical, the strategic, right? The aftermath and the analysis. Obviously, the B-29 is very famous. It's got the pressurized cabin. It had primitive computerized machine guns that could be operated, I believe, by the pilot. It had a tail gunner still pressurized, so you could wear a shirt in it. No more, your blood as you're getting shot up, your blood and your piss freezing like all over the cockpit, like in Europe. Right, most expensive weapon developed during World War II. Right. And it was primarily used against the Japanese, flying out of bases in China, parts of China that were not occupied by the Japanese, using strategic bombing, right? The whole strategic bombing idea that was used in Europe. Now, it was a lot of overcast, very cloudy apparently in Japan. You think of the Pacific Northwest, right? Well, Japan is along the same latitude, right? Longitude, one of those. Also, the jet stream coming out of Siberia, right, coming out of the Soviet Union, made it very difficult, very windy. And you see, of course, the parameters here, right? The Japanese home islands, bombing from, here in China, right? Of course, a lot of China has Japanese troops running around, and your bases can be attacked. This is why they did the island campaign where the Marines slogged up to try to get close, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, right? So then you could start building runways so you could launch bombing attacks. Now, the difficulty of strategic bombing was that it just didn't work. It was hard to do even in Germany, of course, during the day. The Germans had much better fighter capabilities, anti-aircraft, what have you, more developed radar than the Japanese. So essentially, the Japanese weren't really able to do much damage with their interceptors or their few flak guns, and the Americans couldn't do much either. I mean, very unsuccessful raids. You got some of the cool, especially the late war single engine fighters, some of the really good planes, right? The Hayate, the Raiden, right? Thunderbolt, the Shiden, right? The Violet Lightning, really cool. Some of these planes were really, really good. Right? They still had plenty of the old planes, but they really couldn't do much damage. They flew from really high up also. Now, Curtis LeMay obviously was in the European theater. If you ever read his biography, I did. He was in all those. He flew like 30 missions over Germany. He was on the Schweinfurt raids. He was on the worst of the worst. So this guy was definitely a combat, not a guy leading from the front. He was in those planes. He came up with different formations and other things to try to deal with the Germans. But when he got to Japan, he had to replace this guy. There was still an idea of using pinpoint bombing. Very difficult with the Japanese also because it wasn't not as built up. They had their machinery kind of spread out. So he got the idea of course, what they had done in Europe. What did the British do? They bombed at night because it was harder to hit them. Although the German night fighting capabilities soon matched them and gave them problems, but they would drop incendiary bombs. Most of Japan was still paper and wood houses and structures. As if it was stuff that it was still vulnerable to incendiary bombs. So came up with an idea. Right. Here we go. March 9th, 10th, right? Got the idea that it was very unpopular that they were going to ditch. They was going to have no machine gun ammo. The Japanese were pretty. There's nothing to worry about. They could ignore the fighters and the anti-aircraft because they were really not effective. And they were going to just have incendiary bombs. They weren't going to use. They weren't going to use the explosive bombs. They were going to use 335 B-29s, and they were going to fly really, really low. Right, really low. Right, and they wouldn't fly in formation either. Right, they didn't even need as much fuel. Right, they would have more fuel because they needed less of it to get to a higher thing. Right, this was ominous to the crews. A lot of them thought it was a suicide mission. Okay. LeMay's calculation was simple. Japanese night fighter capability was so bad, right, it could be ignored. So carrying ammunition to fight them was unnecessary. Right? Pretty much all of the things. The real thing was they wanted to overwhelm the ability for the Japanese to fight the fires. Right? And as you can see here, right, Tokyo, a large city of almost 7 million inhabitants, only had 4 ladder trucks. Okay? And Japan had not really been bombed successfully at all up to this point. The raid succeeded beyond planners' most optimistic predictions. Incendiaries caused enough fires to overwhelm the firefighters. Small fires merged into large fires. Sound familiar? Sounds like Hamburg, Dresden. It picked up 21 miles per hour, right, creating a wave firestorm, right, a firestorm to purify, right. Updrafts tossed the B-29s as if they were paper planes, right. Fires were so intense they consumed all oxygen, suffocating anyone in the bomb shelters. The fires bombed until well after sunrise. When they finally burned out, almost 16 square miles of Tokyo, containing over 250,000 buildings, were ashes. Their fire engines had been destroyed and caught in the firestorm. Casualties ranged between 83,000 and 150,000 dead. It was the deadliest air raid of the war. Right? It was I keep saying it was essentially the largest single killing event in the history of the planet, with the definition of the single continuous killing event. It wasn't not like Mongols killing millions of people over a course of 10 years. A single action. This killed the most people ever on the planet. In a country that had not really been bombed up to that point, they lost 9 B-29s. Right? The crew, I think it's like 8 or 9 guys. So that's still, and 42 were damaged. Of course, a lot was non-combat stuff. It could be temperamental. The Super Fortress. Right? I forgot to tell you that was the name. The B-29 Super Fortress. Right? There's some influence on that if you look at the Millennium Falcon. Why I bring that up, I don't know. But the bombings continued throughout March. Right? Osaka, right? Nagoya, all the cities you think of. Right? So I may have missed Tokyo, but I'm in time for Osaka. Right? Look at this. Right? Look at this. Right? Of course, the firefighters, like, where do you see this? You see this in Godzilla. Right? I keep saying Godzilla is as informed by the fire bombings as it was the atomic bombing. Okay, you want to talk about a movie which really encapsulates that in a very, very unsettling way, I would say. You got that attitude across better in a fantasy film that you could in any documentary. Okay, Um, yeah. And they switched it up. They did precision bombing. Okay. They still caused a lot of havoc. The Japanese got a little better at inflicting losses. Okay. Other thing they did, which is almost forgotten, Operation Starvation. Okay, using the B-29s to do something that the Navy felt like they were cutting in on their action, but this was also very successful and very underrated in terms of you're blockading the ports and waterways using naval mines. The B-29s drop mines. All you gotta do is drop the thing in the water, so pretty safe. Mining mission 8. Deviation from Army Air Force. Remember, it's the Army Air Force. There's no Air Force yet. Doctrine. What is your doctrine? It's the same as everything else: economics, politics, philosophy. And these are some of the mines they dropped. Anyway, it just continues on. The Japanese have no chance. No chance. And it's interesting too. They actually had early kamikazes. I'd say, but the hind fighters, they were used to ram into. Look at this, Jesus Christ! To ram into the B-29s actually caused a lot of havoc. Those guys, just like the Germans, were ordered to. They were supposed to jump out. They were supposed to not die for the emperor, but supposed to live another day. So that's interesting. But of course, this is early 45. My God, look at this. Yeah. So, and like I said, the photos, it's nothing like the photos, man. Right? Kobe, right, where the beef is from. Great artwork, painted artwork. No computer stuff, right? Now, I'm just basically saying, look at that at night. You think I'm going to go on a tirade or something? There's no point. You know how I feel. You know how I feel about the war. You know how I feel about America. You know how I feel about this. Wow, look at that though, man. That is definitely going into like Buck Rogers territory, right? Star Wars, right? Of course, the big one, right? But essentially, right, the aftermath and analysis, right? You're gonna get the atomic bomb along with the Soviet declaration of war, or not to mention the Soviet blitzkrieg in Manchuria, which I went over. It gets credit for ending the war with Japan, right? But guys like LeMay, and even usually I rip on MacArthur, but they even mentioned that they didn't even think that the bombing was, the atomic bombing was even necessary in terms of the Japanese wanted to surrender. What they don't mention is the Japanese really did want to surrender. All right, the Japanese, didn't want to admit defeat. They did. They actually were trying to negotiate. But of course, what is total war? There's no negotiate. You surrender or we keep fucking you up. Okay, so you're going to have these people who are going to fight to the death. And of course, you had Japanese that were willing to do that. So when you had the atomic bombings, you had some guys thinking, well, they probably have two. Let's keep fighting. And those guys were actually correct at the time. They didn't have any more, but anyway. Right, conventional bombing by B-29s reduced 67 of Japan's largest cities to ashes, mostly through incendiary raids. Right, 2 atomic bombs destroyed roughly 7 square miles of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The firebombing campaign that began in March burned out 170 square miles of Japanese built-up urban area. The mining campaign, where they mined the waterways, Operation Starvation, reduced shipping by 98%. They had no chance. No chance. Okay, and now of course the atomic bombing, I think it's fucking horrible. I think all of this is horrible. We shouldn't have been fighting the Japanese. Okay? But the horror of this, I'm gonna read an excerpt from a book with it. Okay, at the end of the day, though, I'm not gonna be Mr. Moral pearl clutcher just to aim it at my enemies. I mean, it was sort of post all that in a way. I mean, not really, but. Curtis LeMay, the man had a job. Okay, the man's first responsibility were to his pilots. Right, I'm not justifying anything. The need to justify things is garbage. It's bullshit, guys. It really is at this point anymore. Okay, you justify to wield power over people. Okay, the moral conscience is a secondary thing. The man had a job to do, and he figured out how to do it. Japan was probably the air campaign was enough. They never had to go in underground like in Germany. At what cost to humanity and to all of us? Well, you're seeing that cost. You're paying that cost right now, my friends. You're paying it right now.